Hi, welcome back to Media Ethics. I hope you had an enjoyable Memorial Day weekend. Hopefully by now, too, you've read through the readings that deal with ethics philosophers, because we're going to be reviewing these one more time. Even though some of the readings talk about other theories and approaches, we're going to concentrate on just three: virtue theories, duty theories, or consequentialist theories. Specifically, we're going to look at these as philosophical approaches or ethical approaches as opposed to looking at the philosophers themselves. This is a survey course, and so it would require much more reading and in-depth studying to really know the nuances of each of the philosophers. So instead, we're going to take their ideas and look at them as ethical approaches. We'll be talking about Aristotle in terms of his golden mean, Kant in terms of following rules, and Mill in terms of the greatest good. Virtue theories focus on character rather than the behavior itself. It considers the kind of person we want to be, and we talk about this in terms of Aristotle's golden mean or the doctrine of the mean. As you can see, Aristotle is the oldest of our philosophers we'll be talking about, and his virtue theory refers to there's a moral virtue point located in between two vices. Okay, as you can see here, here's a portrait of him. A moral virtue is a middle state determined by practical wisdom. And how that applies to journalism is, there's a couple of different ways you can approach a story. One from a very, very sensationalistic perspective, where you really sort of dig out dirt, talk to all kinds of witnesses, rely on gossip, sensationalism, and so forth. And maybe on the other extreme is just the bare bones, the basic facts. Aristotle's golden mean would be somewhere in between, where you do want to address human interest aspect of a story, talk to various news sources, but you probably just wouldn't get too sensationalistic. Okay, duty theories. They are not concerned with outcomes or consequences. Instead, they refer to the act themselves. So they act on principles without regard to the consequences. And some critics argue that you do not find too many Kantian journalists in the newsroom because they are absolutists. So they come up with rules and provide few exceptions to those rules. Sometimes you see it referred to as Kant's categorical imperative. Okay, and speaking of rules, here's a very obvious one. You'll find that most newsrooms do not, as a matter of an operating policy, do not publish rape victims' names, unless, of course, the victim wants to out herself or himself. Okay, so the newsroom will decide publishing rape victims' names without their permission is wrong. It's wrong under every circumstance. Okay, with Kant and duty theory, it's the idea of acting on the maxim or the rule that you will to become universal law. So what is right for one is right for all, no exceptions. As you can see here, again, act only on that maxim whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law, one that you would follow. For example, as I mentioned the other day, you wouldn't plagiarize not because you're afraid you get caught, but because you consider it morally wrong. The same thing with lying. And speaking of lying, just kind of for fun, I'll show you a clip from a movie that was called The Invention of Lying. The whole idea is until Ricky Gervais invented lying, everybody spoke the truth, no matter how blatant.
Morning, Shelley. Hi, Mark. I realize more and more every day how overqualified I am for this position and how incompetent you are at yours. Any messages? Anthony is coming up within the hour to see if he can get up the courage to fire you. If he can't, he said that he'll definitely do it tomorrow. Anything else? Any messages not to do with being fired? Well, I told everyone you're getting fired this week, and they shouldn't expect their calls returned, so no one left any messages. Okay. Next time? I don't think there'll be a next time. Take the message, just in case I don't get fired. You're almost definitely getting fired.
Okay, consequence ethics is to act on the principle that considers the outcome or the consequences and focus on maximizing happiness and on minimizing harm. Obviously, this is not going to privilege or advantage everyone in a scenario, but the critical mass. I like to reference John Stuart Mill, who advocates the greatest good for the greatest number of people. Act by following the moral rule that will bring about the greatest good for the greatest number. Seek the greatest happiness for the greatest number. And here's an example that I use that could be considered utilitarian journalism or greatest good journalism. This was a piece that came out in New York Magazine about a year ago, and as you can see here, it's all the women who have come forward, at least at that time, who had been sexually assaulted, drugged, or engaged in non-consensual sex with Bill Cosby. There's one chair of somebody who didn't want to be identified. And if you open up the magazine, there were short stories on each woman who, gave her narrative, her what had happened to her. Okay, this doesn't really advantage Bill Cosby, but one could argue that this would provided the greatest good for the greatest number of people, because as you read the story, you realize that a lot of the women didn't come forward because they didn't feel that they would be believed, and so it was only when this story kind of took storm that people started coming out and identifying themselves and telling their story.